After taking this course, I've developed clear philosophies on how I intend to use data in my classroom. As an educator, I find it critical to be constantly collecting data from your students. This shouldn't just be a once a week thing. It should happen multiple times a day, in my opinion. And it can be done so very easily just by even talking in class. That's the method of data collection. And you can go off this and adapt instruction accordingly. So educators can personalize the learning from the data they've collected and design instruction that meets the unique needs of students in a multitude of ways, not just through individualized pathways, but also in considering whole group needs and small group needs. And then by doing so, educators can effectively and efficiently support all learners. So I will use the data I collect in a way to know where I need to adjust accordingly. So if my data collection indicates the whole class is struggling with the concept, I will adjust whole group instruction to meet the broad needs of the entire class. But if a handful of students seem to be struggling with the concept, I will differentiate instruction based on their shared needs. And then, of course, if it's just an individual struggling, I will adapt my teaching to support the unique needs of each individual. So in turn, I find it critical to constantly be collecting data, and I really do feel like it will save you time in the future because you'll know where you need to work more with students and where you don't. And you'll know when it's okay to move on and when it's not. So though collecting data might seem overwhelming at first, it's actually quite easy, and there's so many ways to do it effectively. And in turn, you're going to help yourself better understand your learners. You're going to build relationships, and you're going to be able to personalize instruction easier and in a more manageable way. So as a special educator, I find it even more critical for me to track data so I can see how close my students are to meeting their IEP goals and benchmarks, as well as just the Common Core standards. So it's important to collect data in a variety of ways to get the most accurate data to use. So that being said, I'll be sure to include both formative and summative assessments in the classroom. So I'll use formative assessments to help my students in tracking them. And I will be using formative in the way of incorporating quizzes, talking in class, homework, and exit surveys to collect data from them. And then I will then study the data and adjust my teaching methods and instruction accordingly as I've addressed. I personally feel as if administering formative assessments will help students have higher scores on summative assessments in the future, because when students are constantly monitoring student growth and adjust instruction to ensure continuous improvement, they find it easier and more predictable to progress towards meeting the standards that are often assessed in summative assessments. So summative assessments will help me determine if my students have met objectives, benchmarks for a whole lesson unit, and then it's also will show up in summative assessments, which, although I don't have to say if they're administered or not, I think formative assessments will help students be ready to take these big statewide tests. Especially unit tests. If I adapt and study their learning throughout the whole lesson and lessons, they'll hopefully do better at the end of the unit test, because I'll hopefully have cleared up any confusion or any clarification and addressed concerns or issues right on. So I think flexibility of assessment is extremely important, especially when it's centered around IEP goals, because each student will be being likely assessed and focused on different goals. So a different form of data collection would be more fitting than a different one. So basically what I'm trying to say is I think it's okay, you need to adjust what data and how you're collecting data given the student and the situation. So a method of data collection I want to use with all my students is using exit tickets 1 to 3 times a week. Each exit ticket will include a question revolved around what we have learned, but it also will give students an opportunity to ask questions if they don't feel comfortable asking in class, or it didn't register for them to ask during class. So in correlation, I plan on being a very organized teacher, and I think this will assist on me collecting the best data and being able to use data to the best of my abilities. So In correlation to this, I intend to create a folder for each student I'm working with on Google Drive or another platform and track their progress. Not only will this benefit me in readily being able to see where a student is at and where they need to be, but I also have a great data to share with their parents, other teachers, and the student themselves, so we can look together to see where the student's at, where the student's progressing, where the student's still struggling, and their essentially just their strengths and weaknesses. So just to go over everything I said about my philosophies and everything else is I do think data is extremely important and needs to be collected day after day, lesson after lesson, and I think it's helpful to know it can be done in so many ways, specifically with technology nowadays. Put things such as Kahoot or Google Drive. Kahoot or Pear Deck will give you information on your students right away. You'll readily have it, and you can see where they're at. So I think that's extremely helpful and going to be beneficial when I have a job, and I will be taking advantage of that for sure. And I will use a variety of formative and summative assessments. Personally, for me, I prefer formative assessments, but I will use those formative assessments to assure my students' summative assessments turn out high, and they have higher scores, and hopefully take care of all the understanding and confusion before they're faced with these summative assessments. And I will collect evidence of data in the classroom and monitor progress of the students by having that Google Drive, by trying to incorporate all kinds of mini check-ins with the students. I think Classroom Talk is one example that doesn't get enough credit. Just having a normal conversation with a student or in the class as a whole is an easy, fast way to collect data, and it's free. So I think that's also important to address. There are so many free ways to collect data or non-hassle ways to collect data that it would be silly not to constantly be checking data. So I plan to analyze data on an ongoing basis by constantly administering it for one and then staying organized for two. And then from the data I've collected, I'll be able to make intentional decisions whether I adapt learning for an individual pathway, a small group, a large group, and what exactly that student or students need. Whether this be more note-taking, whether this be reteaching, modeling, and then I will communicate to the individual students and their families and other teachers by having this Google Drive readily available, but also hopefully setting up an understanding of what students can do to help themselves more, what I can do to help them more, and then finally what they can do at home to help themselves more. So that's another way data can be extremely important, and yeah.